The crimson sun bled through the skeletal remains of downtown Portland as Zephyr Blackwood pressed her back against the cold concrete wall, listening to the rhythmic scraping of claws against asphalt. 3 months had passed since the first outbreak, and the world she once knew had crumbled into a nightmare of flesh and bone. The morning air carried the stench of decay, a constant reminder that humanity's reign had ended with a whimper rather than a roar. Zephyr's fingers tightened around the makeshift spear she'd crafted from a broken street sign, its jagged edge still stained with the black ichor that passed for blood in the creatures that now roamed the earth. At 28, she had been a marine biologist studying coral reef restoration. Now she was something else entirely, a hunter, a survivor, a guardian of the few precious lives that remained in their makeshift sanctuary. The scraping grew louder, accompanied by the wet, guttural moans that haunted her dreams. Through a crack in the wall, she glimpsed them, 3 of the infected shambling past, their once human forms twisted into grotesque parodies of life. Their skin hung in gray tatters, revealing muscle and bone beneath, while their eyes had turned a milky white that seemed to glow in the dim light. These weren't the fast, aggressive variants that had appeared in recent weeks, these were the original strain, slow but relentless, driven by an insatiable hunger for living flesh. Behind her, in the abandoned subway station they called home, 47 souls waited for her return. Among them was Kestrel Thorne, a former emergency room surgeon whose steady hands had saved more lives in the past 3 months than in his entire medical career. His dark hair had gone prematurely gray from stress, but his green eyes still held the fierce determination that had kept their group alive through countless encounters with the infected. There was also Indira Voss, barely 19 but possessing an uncanny ability to predict the infected's movement patterns. She had been studying behavioral psychology before the world ended, and now she applied that knowledge to understanding their enemies. Her slight frame belied a sharp intellect that had guided them through several narrow escapes. The group's unofficial leader was Caspian Reed, a former park ranger whose knowledge of survival tactics and natural navigation had proven invaluable. His weathered face bore the scars of numerous battles, but his voice remained calm and reassuring when panic threatened to overwhelm the survivors. He had lost his wife and daughter in the initial outbreak, a tragedy that had hardened him into the protector they all needed. Zephyr waited until the infected passed before slipping back through the concealed entrance to their underground refuge. The subway platform had been transformed into a functional living space, with sleeping areas sectioned off by hanging blankets and a central area where they gathered for meals and planning sessions. Solar panels salvaged from abandoned buildings powered LED lights that cast a warm glow over their makeshift home. "Any sign of the supply convoy?" Caspian asked as she descended the rusted stairs. His voice carried the weight of responsibility that never seemed to leave him. Zephyr shook her head. "Nothing yet. But I saw movement near the old hospital. Could be survivors, could be trouble." She paused, studying the faces gathered around her. "We need to make a decision about the radio transmission we picked up yesterday." The transmission had been brief but clear. A group calling themselves the Northern Alliance claimed to have established a safe zone in what remained of Seattle. They promised food, medical supplies, and protection for any survivors who could make the journey. It sounded too good to be true, which in their experience usually meant it was. "It's a trap," muttered Orion Blackthorne, Zephyr's younger brother and the group's electronics specialist. His paranoia had kept them alive more than once, but it also made him resistant to any plan that involved trusting outsiders. Nobody broadcasts their location unless they want to draw people in for the wrong reasons. Indira looked up from the map she'd been studying. "The migration patterns suggest the infected are moving north anyway. If we stay here much longer, we'll be overrun." Her voice was soft but carried an authority that belied her age. As night fell over their sanctuary, Zephyr found herself staring at the tunnel entrance, wondering if tomorrow would bring salvation or destruction. The infected were evolving, becoming smarter and more aggressive with each passing week. Their current refuge wouldn't remain safe forever, and the promise of the Northern Alliance grew more tempting with each day of dwindling supplies. In the distance, a howl echoed through the tunnels, not the moan of the shambling infected, but something new, something that made her blood run cold. The dark forces threatening Earth were growing stronger, and their small band of survivors would soon face their greatest test yet. The howl that had chilled Zephyr's blood the night before returned with the dawn, closer this time and accompanied by others. Caspian gathered the group in the central area, his expression grim as he spread out a hand-drawn map of the surrounding area. Red X's marked locations where they'd encountered the infected, while blue circles indicated potential supply caches and safe routes. "We've got a problem," he announced, his finger tracing a path along the tunnel system. Indira's behavioral analysis was right. The infected are moving in coordinated groups now, and they're learning to use the subway tunnels. Dr. Kestrel Thorne looked up from bandaging a survivor's infected wound, not from a bite, but from a rusty piece of metal that could prove just as deadly in their current circumstances. "How long do we have?" he asked, his medical training making him acutely aware of how quickly situations could deteriorate. "Maybe 48 hours before they find us," Indira replied, her young face etched with worry. She had been tracking the infected's movement patterns for weeks, noting how they seemed to communicate through subsonic frequencies that human ears couldn't detect. But there's something else. The howling, it's not random. It's a hunting call. Orion looked up from the radio equipment he'd been tinkering with, his face pale. "I've been monitoring emergency frequencies all night. There are other groups out there, but they're going silent one by one. Whatever's hunting us, it's systematic." The revelation sent a chill through the assembled survivors. They had grown accustomed to the shambling hordes of the original infected, learning to avoid them or fight them when necessary. But this new threat suggested an intelligence behind the chaos, a guiding force that turned random horror into calculated terror. Zephyr studied the faces around her, seeing her own fear reflected in their eyes. Among them was Lyra Nightingale, a former teacher who had become their unofficial counselor, helping survivors cope with the psychological trauma of their new reality. Her gentle nature had been a source of comfort for the children in their group, but even she seemed shaken by this latest development. "The Northern Alliance transmission," Zephyr said finally. "Maybe it's not a trap. Maybe it's our only chance." Caspian nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing. But the journey to Seattle is over 200 miles through infected territory. We'd need vehicles, fuel, weapons, and enough supplies to last at least a week. There's an abandoned military depot about 30 miles north," offered Tobias Grimm, a former security guard whose knowledge of the area's infrastructure had proven invaluable. His scarred hands spoke of numerous encounters with the infected, but his tactical mind remained sharp. "If we could reach it, we might find what we need." The discussion continued for hours, with each survivor contributing their expertise to the planning process. Serafina Cross, a former mechanic, outlined what they would need to get vehicles running. Dante Ashford, who had worked in logistics before the outbreak, calculated supply requirements and potential routes. Even the youngest members of their group, like 15-year-old Phoenix Sterling, offered insights based on their observations of infected behavior. As the day wore on, the howling grew more frequent and seemed to come from multiple directions. The infected were closing in, and their window of opportunity was shrinking rapidly. Zephyr found herself thinking about the world that had existed before the outbreak, when her biggest concern had been the bleaching of coral reefs rather than the extinction of humanity itself. The decision came when young Phoenix burst into their meeting area, his face flushed with terror. "They're in the tunnels," he gasped. "I saw them from the north entrance. Dozens of them, moving together like they're following orders." Through the subway platform's speakers, which Orion had rigged to work as an early warning system, came the sound of scraping claws and shuffling feet. But underneath it all was something else, a low, rhythmic tapping that sounded almost like Morse code. "They're communicating," Indira whispered, her face going white. "They're not just hunting us. They're coordinating." Caspian stood, his decision made. "We leave tonight. Everyone pack only what you can carry. We make for the military depot, then push on to Seattle if we can." He looked around at the faces of the people who had become his family. "This isn't just about survival anymore. If there really is a safe zone, if there's a chance to rebuild, then we owe it to everyone we've lost to try." As the survivors began their frantic preparations, Zephyr caught sight of something that made her blood freeze. Through the crack in the wall where she had observed the infected that morning, a single eye stared back at her. But this wasn't the milky white of the typical infected. This eye was clear, intelligent, and unmistakably aware. The dark forces threatening Earth had found them, and they were running out of time. The military depot loomed before them like a fortress of rusted metal and broken promises. Zephyr crouched behind an overturned truck, watching the facility through binoculars as the first rays of dawn painted the sky a sickly yellow. Their journey from the subway sanctuary had taken 18 hours of careful movement through infected territory, and they had lost 2 people along the way, elderly Marcus Webb to a heart attack brought on by stress, and brave Celeste Rivers to a pack of the fast-moving infected that had ambushed their rear guard. "Perimeter looks clear," she whispered to Caspian, who lay beside her studying the depot's layout. "But that doesn't mean anything anymore." The facility sprawled across several acres, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Guard towers stood empty at each corner, their windows dark and lifeless. Several buildings dotted the compound, including what appeared to be vehicle maintenance bays and supply warehouses. If they were lucky, they would find weapons, ammunition, and perhaps even armored vehicles that could carry them safely to Seattle. Behind them, the remaining 39 survivors waited in the treeline, exhausted from their night-long trek. Dr. Kestrel Thorne tended to minor injuries while Lyra Nightingale comforted the children who had witnessed too much horror for their young minds to process. The group's morale was fragile, held together by nothing more than desperate hope and Caspian's unwavering leadership. Movement in Building 3, Orion reported from his position with the radio equipment. He had been monitoring military frequencies, hoping to pick up any signs of remaining government forces. Could be survivors, could be infected. Hard to tell from here. Indira studied the depot through her own binoculars, her analytical mind working to identify patterns in what they observed. "The infected we've been tracking should have reached this area hours ago, but I don't see any signs of them. Either they're avoiding this place for a reason, or they're already inside," Zephyr finished grimly. Caspian made the decision that would define their fate. "We go in fast and quiet. Zephyr, take Tobias and Dante to secure the vehicle bay. Kestrel, you and Serafina check the medical supplies. I'll take Orion and Phoenix to the armory." He looked back at the group of survivors. "Everyone else stays here with Lyra and Indira. If we're not back in 2 hours, head north without us." The infiltration began at dawn, with each team moving through carefully cut holes in the perimeter fence. Zephyr's team reached the vehicle bay without incident, finding it filled with military trucks and Humvees in various states of repair. Serafina's mechanical expertise proved invaluable as she quickly identified which vehicles were operational and what supplies they would need to get them running. "This one's good to go," she whispered, patting the hood of a armored personnel carrier. "Diesel engine, reinforced windows, and enough space for 20 people. If we can find fuel, this could be our ticket to Seattle." Meanwhile, Caspian's team had reached the armory, only to discover that it had been thoroughly looted. Empty weapon racks lined the walls, and ammunition boxes lay scattered and empty across the floor. But Orion's sharp eyes spotted something the previous scavengers had missed, a hidden panel on the wall that concealed a cache of military-grade equipment. "Jackpot," Phoenix breathed as they revealed night vision goggles, tactical radios, and several cases of high-powered rifles with full magazines. Dr. Thorne's medical supply run proved equally successful, with the depot's infirmary yielding antibiotics, surgical equipment, and enough medical supplies to last their group for months. But their success was short-lived, as the sound of approaching vehicles echoed across the compound. Through the depot's windows, they watched in horror as a convoy of modified trucks approached the main gate. The vehicles were armored with welded metal plates and bristled with weapons, but it was their occupants that made Zephyr's blood run cold. These weren't survivors seeking refuge, they were raiders, the human predators who had emerged in the wake of civilization's collapse to prey upon the weak and desperate. "Marauders," Tobias growled, recognizing the threat immediately. His security background had taught him to identify dangerous individuals, and these men radiated violence and cruelty. They must have been tracking us. The raiders moved with military precision, suggesting they were either former soldiers or had recruited someone with tactical training. Their leader, a scarred man with cold eyes, directed his forces to surround the depot while others began cutting through the fence with power tools. "We're trapped," Dante whispered into his radio. "They've got us surrounded, and there's nowhere to run." But Caspian's voice came back steady and determined. "Then we don't run. We fight. These people chose to become monsters when the world needed heroes. We show them what real survivors look like." The battle for the depot began with the raiders' assault on the main building, their weapons chattering as they sprayed bullets through windows and doorways. But Zephyr's team had the advantage of knowing the facility's layout, and they used that knowledge to mount a guerrilla defense that frustrated the attackers' attempts to advance. From her position in the vehicle bay, Zephyr watched as Serafina worked frantically to get the armored personnel carrier running while Tobias and Dante held off raiders trying to breach their position. The sound of gunfire echoed through the compound, punctuated by the screams of the wounded and the dying. But in the distance, barely audible over the chaos of battle, came a sound that made everyone freeze, the howling of the infected, drawn by the noise of combat. The dark forces that threatened Earth were converging on their position, and the real fight was just beginning. The infected arrived like a tide of death, pouring through the gaps in the depot's perimeter fence as the raiders' gunfire had torn open. Zephyr watched in horrified fascination as the two groups of enemies, human and inhuman, collided in a chaos of violence that defied comprehension. The raiders, caught between their assault on the depot and the sudden appearance of dozens of infected, found themselves fighting a war on two fronts. "Engines running!" Serafina shouted over the cacophony of gunfire and inhuman screams. The armored personnel carrier rumbled to life, its diesel engine providing a bass note to the symphony of destruction surrounding them. Through the vehicle bay's reinforced windows, Zephyr could see the raiders' leader barking orders at his men, trying to maintain some semblance of tactical control as infected swarmed over their positions. Several raiders had already fallen, their screams cut short as claws and teeth found their mark. But these weren't the slow, shambling infected they had grown accustomed to. These were the evolved variants, moving with purpose and coordination that spoke of an intelligence guiding their actions. "Caspian, we need to move now." Zephyr spoke into her radio, watching as more infected poured into the compound. "The whole area's going to be overrun in minutes." "Copy that," came his reply, strained with the effort of combat. "We're pinned down in the armory. Can you get the APC to our position?" Tobias Grimm had taken position at the vehicle bay's entrance, his rifle picking off infected that tried to approach their location. His security training showed in every precise shot, but even his skill couldn't hold back the growing horde indefinitely. "We've got maybe 30 seconds before they breach our perimeter," he called out. Dante Ashford was loading supplies into the APC with mechanical efficiency, his logistics background helping him prioritize what they could carry and what they would have to leave behind. Medical supplies, ammunition, and food took precedence over everything else, while personal belongings were abandoned without hesitation. The decision to make a run for the armory came when Zephyr spotted something that made her stomach turn. Among the infected streaming into the compound, she recognized faces. Raiders who had fallen just minutes before were now rising again, their fresh wounds still bleeding as they joined the hunt for living flesh. The infection was spreading faster than ever before, turning the dead into weapons within moments of their demise. "The infection rate has accelerated," she reported into her radio, her voice tight with fear. "Fresh converts are turning almost immediately. Whatever's driving this evolution, it's getting stronger." Serafina gunned the APC's engine, smashing through the vehicle bay doors in a shower of metal and glass. The armored vehicle's bulk scattered infected like bowling pins, but more kept coming, their claws scraping against the reinforced hull as they tried to find purchase. Through the thick windows, Zephyr could see their faces, or what remained of them, twisted into expressions of mindless hunger. The journey across the depot's courtyard became a nightmare of grinding metal and inhuman screams. Infected threw themselves at the APC with suicidal determination, while surviving raiders fired desperately at anything that moved. One raider, his arm hanging useless at his side, made eye contact with Zephyr through the vehicle's window. For a moment, she saw not a predator but a terrified human being facing the same extinction that threatened them all. "There!" Dante pointed toward the armory building, where muzzle flashes indicated Caspian's team was still fighting. "Second floor, northeast corner." The APC's reinforced bumper smashed through the armory's loading dock doors, and Zephyr leaped out before the vehicle had fully stopped. The building's interior was a maze of overturned furniture and scattered equipment, with the sound of gunfire echoing from the upper levels. She took the stairs 3 at a time, her makeshift spear ready for whatever horrors awaited above. She found Caspian's team barricaded in a supply room, with Phoenix Sterling pressed against the far wall, his young face pale with shock. Dr. Kestrel Thorne was treating a deep gash on Orion's arm while Caspian maintained watch at the doorway, his rifle trained on the corridor beyond. "How bad?" Zephyr asked, assessing the situation quickly. "Orion took a raider's knife, but he'll live," Kestrel replied without looking up from his work. "The real problem is what we found in the basement levels." Caspian's expression was grim as he gestured toward a tablet Phoenix had been carrying. "Show her what you recorded." The footage was shaky and dark, but clear enough to make Zephyr's blood freeze. In the depot's lower levels, they had discovered what appeared to be a laboratory, not military, but something far more sinister. Holding cells lined the walls, their doors torn open from the inside. Medical equipment lay scattered across the floor, along with research notes written in multiple languages. "Someone was experimenting on the infected," Phoenix explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "Trying to make them smarter, faster, more coordinated." The notes mentioned something called Project Lazarus and a Dr. Evelyn Blackwood. Zephyr's heart stopped. "Blackwood? That's my family name." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Somewhere in her family tree was someone responsible for the evolution of the infected, for the intelligence that now guided their movements. The dark forces threatening Earth weren't just random chaos, they were the result of human ambition and scientific hubris. "We need to get back to the others," Caspian said, shouldering his pack. "This place is compromised, and we have information that could be vital to any remaining government forces." The retreat to the APC became a running battle through corridors filled with infected and the occasional surviving raider. Zephyr found herself fighting alongside men who had been trying to kill her minutes before, united by the common threat of extinction. One raider, a young man barely older than Phoenix, pressed a photograph into her hands before an infected's claws opened his throat. "My sister," he gasped with his dying breath. Tell her I tried to find her." The APC's engine roared as they smashed through the depot's main gate, leaving behind a compound overrun with infected and littered with the bodies of raiders and soldiers alike. In the distance, smoke rose from other battles, other desperate struggles for survival playing out across the wasteland that had once been civilization. As they drove toward the treeline where their group waited, Zephyr studied the photograph the dying raider had given her. It showed a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, someone who might have been a teacher or a nurse before the world ended. She wondered if the woman was still alive, still hoping for her brother's return. "The Northern Alliance," she said finally, looking up at Caspian. "If they really have established a safe zone, they need to know about Project Lazarus. They need to know that someone is still out there, still experimenting, still making things worse." Through the APC's rear window, she could see the depot burning in the distance, consumed by fires that would burn for days. But somewhere in that inferno lay the answers to questions that could determine humanity's fate. The dark forces threatening Earth had a name now, and a face, and perhaps most terrifyingly of all, a purpose. The decision to make a run for the armory came when. The reunion with their group in the treeline was bittersweet, marked by relief at their survival and grief for those they had lost. Lyra Nightingale gathered the children close as Zephyr and the others emerged from the APC, her maternal instincts providing comfort in a world that offered precious little. Indira Voss immediately began analyzing the tactical situation, her young mind processing the implications of what they had discovered at the depot. 37 souls remaining, Caspian announced quietly, his voice carrying the weight of leadership that had aged him beyond his years. "We have vehicles, weapons, and supplies. but we also have knowledge that changes everything. Dr. Kestrel Thorne had set up a makeshift medical station using supplies from the depot, treating the wounded while listening to Zephyr's account of Project Lazarus. His medical training helped him understand the scientific implications better than most, and his expression grew increasingly troubled as she described the laboratory's contents. "Genetic modification of the infected," he murmured, cleaning a Raider's bullet graze on Tobias Grimm's shoulder. "If someone is actively working to enhance their capabilities, then every day we delay reaching safety makes our situation exponentially worse." Orion Blackthorne, his arm now properly bandaged, had connected his radio equipment to the APC's power system and was scanning frequencies for any sign of the Northern Alliance. Static filled the airwaves, punctuated by occasional distress calls from other survivor groups. Each transmission painted a picture of a world in its death throes, with pockets of humanity struggling against an enemy that grew stronger with each passing hour. "I'm picking up something," he announced suddenly, adjusting the radio's frequency. "It's faint, but it's definitely organized communication. Military protocols, encrypted channels. Someone's still fighting this war." The transmission, when it finally came through clearly, was both hopeful and terrifying. A voice identified itself as Colonel Sarah Martinez of the Northern Alliance, broadcasting from what remained of Joint Base Lewis McChord near Seattle. Her message was brief but clear. They had established a secure perimeter and were actively researching countermeasures against the infected. Any survivors who could reach their position would find sanctuary, medical care, and the chance to join the fight for humanity's survival. But the transmission also contained a warning that made Zephyr's blood run cold. Intelligence reports suggested that the infected were being directed by a central authority, someone with intimate knowledge of their biology and behavior. The Northern Alliance had designated this unknown enemy as the Architect, and they believed this individual was responsible for the recent acceleration in the infected's evolution. "Dr. Evelyn Blackwood," Zephyr whispered, the name feeling like poison on her tongue. "It has to be her." Serafina Cross had been working on the other vehicles they had acquired from the depot, her mechanical expertise ensuring they would have reliable transportation for the journey ahead. 2 additional trucks now bore improvised armor plating, their windows reinforced with metal grating that would stop claws if not bullets. The convoy would be able to carry all 37 survivors, along with their supplies and the precious intelligence they had gathered. As night fell, the group gathered around a small fire, sharing what might be their last peaceful moment together. Phoenix Sterling sat close to Lyra, drawing comfort from her presence while trying to process the horrors he had witnessed. At 15, he had seen more death and violence than most adults could handle, yet he remained determined to survive and help others do the same. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the old days," said Arya Moonwhisper, one of the newer additions to their group, a young woman they had rescued from a raider attack weeks earlier. Her voice carried a musical quality that seemed to soothe the children's fears. "She said that in the darkest times, heroes would rise to protect the innocent. I think that's what we are now, heroes, whether we wanted to be or not." Dante Ashford studied the maps they had acquired, plotting the safest route to Seattle while accounting for known infected concentrations in raider territories. The journey would take them through the heart of what had once been Washington State, across terrain that was now largely unknown and potentially hostile. They would need to travel fast and avoid major population centers, where the infected congregated in massive hordes. 200 miles, he announced, tracing their route with his finger. "If we push hard and don't run into major obstacles, we could make it in 3 days. But that's assuming the roads are clear and we don't encounter any of the super-infected that have been reported in the area." The super-infected were a recent development, creatures that had undergone multiple stages of mutation to become something barely recognizable as human. Reports described them as larger, faster, and more intelligent than the standard infected, capable of coordinating complex attacks and even using simple tools. If Project Lazarus was responsible for their creation, then Dr. Evelyn Blackwood had succeeded in creating the perfect predator. As the fire burned low, Zephyr found herself staring at the photograph the dying raider had given her. The young woman's face seemed to glow in the firelight, a reminder that somewhere in the darkness, people were still hoping, still believing that their loved ones would return. She folded the photograph carefully and placed it in her jacket pocket, a promise to herself that she would find a way to honor the raiders' final request. "We leave at first light," Caspian announced, his decision final. "The Northern Alliance is our best hope for survival, and they need to know about Project Lazarus. If we can help them stop the architect, we might actually have a chance to reclaim our world." But as the survivors settled in for what might be their last night of relative safety, none of them noticed the pale figure watching from the tree-line. The infected scout stood motionless among the shadows, its enhanced intelligence processing everything it had observed. When it finally moved, it did so with purpose, carrying news of the survivors' plans to its master. The architect would be ready for them. Dawn broke gray and cold over their makeshift camp, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain before the day was through. Zephyr helped load the last of their supplies into the convoy while Caspian conducted a final headcount of their group. 37 souls, she reflected, all that remained of the hundreds who had once called Portland home. Each face told a story of loss and survival, of ordinary people forced to become extraordinary by circumstances beyond their control. The convoy consisted of 3 vehicles, the armored personnel carrier leading the way with Serafina at the wheel, followed by 2 reinforced trucks carrying the bulk of their group and supplies. Caspian had assigned the most experienced fighters to each vehicle, ensuring they could respond quickly to any threat they encountered on the road to Seattle. "Radio check," Orion's voice crackled through their communication system as they prepared to depart. He had rigged each vehicle with military-grade radios, allowing them to coordinate their movements and share intelligence about road conditions ahead. "All units, report status." The responses came back clear and strong, a small comfort as they prepared to venture into the unknown. Dr. Kestrel Thorne rode in the second truck with the wounded and the children, his medical supplies within easy reach. Lyra Nightingale sat beside him, her gentle presence helping to calm the younger survivors who were frightened by the prospect of leaving their temporary sanctuary. The first 50 miles passed without incident, their convoy moving through abandoned farmland and small towns that had been evacuated in the early days of the outbreak. Burned-out houses and overturned vehicles dotted the landscape, silent monuments to the speed with which civilization had collapsed. Occasionally they passed other survivors, lone figures or small groups who watched their convoy with a mixture of hope and suspicion. "Contact ahead," Tobias Grimm reported from his position as gunner in the lead vehicle. "Looks like a roadblock, but I can't tell if it's military or raider." The obstacle appeared around a bend in the highway, concrete barriers and overturned cars forming a checkpoint across both lanes of traffic. Figures moved among the barriers, but at this distance it was impossible to determine their intentions. Caspian ordered the convoy to halt while they assessed the situation. Through binoculars, Zephyr could see that the checkpoint was manned by what appeared to be legitimate military personnel. Their uniforms were clean and properly maintained, their weapons held with professional discipline rather than the casual brutality she had come to associate with raiders. A flag flew from a makeshift pole, not the stars and stripes, but something new, bearing the symbol of a phoenix rising from flames. "Northern Alliance," Indira confirmed, her analytical mind processing the visual clues. "The phoenix symbol matches intelligence reports we've heard on the radio. They're legitimate." The checkpoint commander, a weathered sergeant named Marcus Ironwood, greeted them with cautious professionalism. His unit had been stationed here for weeks, screening survivors and gathering intelligence about infected movements in the region. When Caspian explained their mission and the intelligence they carried about Project Lazarus, the sergeant's expression grew grave. "Dr. Evelyn Blackwood," he repeated, the name clearly familiar to him. "Command's been looking for her for months. She disappeared from a CDC facility in Atlanta just before the outbreak began, taking critical research data with her. If you have proof she's behind the infected's evolution, that changes everything." The sergeant provided them with an escort for the remainder of their journey, 2 Humvees filled with Northern Alliance soldiers who had been fighting the infected for months. Their leader, Lieutenant Raven Stormwind, was a young officer whose tactical expertise had earned her rapid promotion in the chaos of the New World. Her presence added both firepower and legitimacy to their convoy. As they approached the outskirts of Seattle, the true scope of the Northern Alliance's operation became apparent. The city had been transformed into a fortress, with massive walls constructed from shipping containers and concrete barriers. Guard towers bristled with weapons, while patrols of soldiers moved with the confidence of people who had found a way to fight back against the darkness. But their arrival was not the triumphant moment Zephyr had hoped for. As their convoy passed through the outer checkpoints, alarms began to sound throughout the compound. Soldiers ran to defensive positions while officers shouted orders into radio handsets. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Massive infected surge approaching from the south, Lieutenant Stoneman reported, her voice tight with tension. Estimated 3,000 individuals, moving in coordinated formation. This isn't a random migration, it's an assault. Through the compound's reinforced windows, Zephyr could see them coming, a tide of infected stretching to the horizon, moving with purpose and coordination that defied everything they thought they knew about the creatures. At their head walked figures that barely looked human anymore, the super-infected, their bodies twisted and enhanced by whatever process Dr. Blackwood had developed. "The architect knows we're here," Caspian said grimly, watching the approaching horde. "This isn't coincidence. We've been led into a trap." Colonel Sarah Martinez, the Northern Alliance commander, met them in the compound's command center as her forces prepared for the largest battle they had ever faced. She was a small woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much, but her voice carried absolute authority as she coordinated the defense. "Your intelligence about Project Lazarus confirms our worst fears," she told Zephyr and Caspian. "Dr. Blackwood isn't just experimenting on the infected, she's controlling them. Every evolution, every new capability, it's all part of a larger plan to remake humanity in her image." The battle for Seattle was about to begin, and Zephyr realized that their journey had been leading to this moment all along. The dark forces threatening Earth had a face now, and a purpose, and they were coming to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. The fight for freedom would be decided here, in the ruins of a city that had once symbolized human achievement and progress. As the first infected reached the outer walls and the sound of gunfire filled the air, Zephyr gripped her weapon and prepared to face the ultimate test of everything they had learned about survival, sacrifice, and the bonds that held humanity together in its darkest hour. The battle raged for 3 days and nights, transforming the Northern Alliance compound into a crucible where the fate of humanity would be decided. Zephyr found herself fighting alongside soldiers she had never met, united by the desperate knowledge that failure meant not just death, but the end of everything human civilization had ever. The battle raged for 3 days and nights, transforming the Northern Alliance compound into a crucible where the fate of humanity would be decided. Zephyr found herself fighting alongside soldiers she had never met, united by the desperate knowledge that failure meant not just death, but the end of everything human civilization had ever achieved. The infected came in waves, each assault more coordinated than the last, their movements guided by an intelligence that chilled her to the bone. On the second day, as ammunition ran low and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm the defenders, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Phoenix Sterling, working with the Alliance's communication specialists, managed to intercept transmissions between the super-infected and their controller. The signals originated from a research facility hidden in the Olympic Mountains, where Dr. Evelyn Blackwood had established her laboratory of horrors. "She's not just controlling them," Phoenix reported, his young face etched with fatigue and determination. "She's broadcasting enhancement protocols in real time. Every infected in the field is receiving updates, becoming stronger and smarter as the battle progresses." Colonel Martinez made the decision that would define the war's outcome. While the main force held the compound's defenses, a strike team would infiltrate Blackwood's facility and attempt to sever the connection between the architect and her army. It was a suicide mission, but it represented their only hope of breaking the cycle of evolution that threatened to make the infected unstoppable. Zephyr volunteered immediately, driven by a sense of responsibility that went beyond mere survival. The woman orchestrating humanity's destruction shared her family name, making this fight deeply personal. Caspian, Dr. Thorne, Indira, and Tobias joined the mission, along with Lieutenant Stormwind and a handful of Alliance Special Forces operators. The journey to the Olympic Mountains took them through terrain that had been completely overrun by infected. Ancient forests now served as hunting grounds for creatures that had once been human, while mountain streams ran red with the blood of countless victims. The facility itself was a marvel of hidden engineering, built into the mountainside and camouflaged so effectively that it was nearly invisible from the air. Inside, they discovered the true scope of Dr. Evelyn Blackwood's madness. Laboratory after laboratory contained specimens in various stages of enhancement, while computer systems displayed research data that revealed decades of preparation for this moment. The woman they found in the central control room bore little resemblance to the brilliant scientist she had once been. Her body showed signs of self-experimentation, with pale skin and eyes that reflected an inhuman intelligence. "You're too late," she told them, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in their bones. "The old world is dying, and from its ashes will rise something far superior. I am evolution's architect, and my children will inherit the earth." The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Zephyr had ever experienced. Dr. Blackwood had enhanced herself with the same processes she used on the infected, granting her superhuman strength and speed. But she had retained her human intelligence, making her an opponent of terrifying capability. The battle destroyed much of the laboratory's equipment, but not before Indira managed to access the central computer system. "I can reverse the enhancement protocols," she called out over the sound of combat. "But someone needs to maintain the connection while I work. The system will fight back, it's designed to protect itself." Caspian made the ultimate sacrifice, placing his hands on the control interface even as electrical feedback began to course through his body. His weathered face contorted in pain, but his voice remained steady as he spoke his final words. Tell them we remembered what it meant to be human." The reversal of the enhancement protocols sent shockwaves through the infected army besieging Seattle. Across the battlefield, super-infected collapsed as their enhanced capabilities failed, while the coordination that had made them so dangerous dissolved into chaos. The tide of battle turned in humanity's favor, but the cost had been devastating. Dr. Blackwood's death came not from their weapons, but from the failure of her own enhancements as the system she had created turned against her. Her final words were a warning that chilled Zephyr's blood. "You think you've won, but this is only the beginning. Others will continue my work. Evolution cannot be stopped." The return to Seattle revealed the true price of their victory. The compound's walls were scarred by battle, and too many faces were missing from the ranks of defenders. Among the fallen was Lyra Nightingale, who had died protecting the children she had come to love as her own. Serafina Cross had given her life to keep the compound's generators running, ensuring that the medical facilities could continue treating the wounded. In the weeks that followed, as the Northern Alliance worked to expand their territory and establish contact with other survivor enclaves, Zephyr found herself changed by everything she had experienced. The photograph of the Raider's sister remained in her pocket, a reminder of the humanity that persisted even in the darkest circumstances. She had eventually found the woman, alive and working as a nurse in a survivor camp near Spokane, and delivered her brother's final message. The world that emerged from the ashes of the outbreak was different from what had come before. Cities lay in ruins, and vast stretches of countryside remained dangerous wilderness where infected still roamed. But humanity had survived, and in surviving, had rediscovered something precious that had been lost in the complexity of modern civilization, the understanding that their strength lay not in their technology or their weapons, but in their willingness to stand together against the darkness. Zephyr often stood on the walls of New Seattle, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of hope and remembrance. The fight for freedom had been won, but at a cost that would echo through generations. In the distance, smoke still rose from the ruins of the old world, while closer to home, the sounds of construction and laughter spoke of humanity's determination to build something better from the wreckage. The dark forces that had threatened Earth were not entirely vanquished. Dr. Blackwood's warning about others continuing her work proved prophetic as new threats emerged in distant corners of the world. But the survivors had learned something invaluable in their struggle, that even in the face of extinction, the human spirit could not be broken, and that sometimes the greatest victories came not from defeating one's enemies, but from refusing to become like them. As night fell over the compound, Zephyr whispered the names of those they had lost: Caspian, Lyra, Serafina, and so many others who had given everything so that others might live. Their sacrifice had purchased tomorrow for the human race, and it was a debt that could never be fully repaid, only honored through the choices made by those who remained. The amazing journey of survivors who had stood together against the darkness was over, but the story of what they would build from the ashes was just beginning.